had I been a physician, I would have been helping one by one. But when you have capital, you're helping at scale.
We should all just be open to as much innovation as we can to solving some of these big problems. Appreciate the risk and return and impact objectives you have, and then start.
Greetings, I'm Vikas Arora, Chief of Impact Investing and Blended Finance at ABPN, and your host for this episode. When we talk about impact investing, we often talk about intentionally deploying capital towards opportunities to create measurable environmental and social outcomes. But what about the systemic barriers that keep capital from reaching the communities that need it most? In this episode, I'm honored to be joined by Roy Swan, Director of Mission Investments at Ford Foundation, and Christine Looney, Deputy Director of Mission Investments at the Ford Foundation as well. Together, they lead the foundation's work in deploying mission-related investments towards unlocking capital and bridging funding gaps. While we will learn about Ford Foundation's theory of change and investment thesis, we will also have the opportunity to learn about Roy and Christine's personal journeys into the impact investing ecosystem, which I'm sure will be fascinating to our audience. So without further ado, let us begin.
Can you share with us your personal journey into the impact investing space and what really led you to spearhead Ford's mission investment program? Yeah, sure. First of all, really great to meet you all, and thanks for thinking of us. So my journey starts from my hometown and my upbringing and the miraculous pathway that my life has taken. And I will tell you that I begin most of my panels or remarks with a couple of things that tell you pretty much everything you need to know about me. And number one, I'm a preacher's kid. And more specifically, what that means is I have grown up and was raised with within what I call the Judeo-Christian, to a large extent Islamic spirit. And one thing that is an overlapping value of all those different religions is to whom much is given, much is expected. So I was brought up to believe that we are all servants to one another. And that is something that I take very seriously. The term much is relative. And what that means is if you go, was that the saying, the turtle's all the way down? If you go all the way down, there's one person who has the least of all of us. So that means everyone has something to contribute regardless of the bounty with which you have been blessed. The second thing is that I am a failed pre-med. I finally got over that failure not to go to med school about 15 years ago, but that's another story. But the reason why I wanted to be a doctor is because I decided when I was 14 years old, when I had to determine what pathway I would take in high school in terms of whether it's vocational or general education or college prep, when I spoke with my big sister, she said, well, if you want to be a doctor, that means you got to go to college. And I told her I wanted to be a doctor because I wanted a job where I was paid to help people. And the Ford Foundation and the previous job I had at Morgan Stanley were both instances where I realized that had I been a physician, I would have been helping one by one. But when you have capital in your hands, you're helping at scale. That's my journey. I was going through your LinkedIn profile as well, Roy. I think very fascinating that you two worked in a bulge bracket investment bank, of course, to lead their sustainable finance and their impact practice. And maybe just a quick follow-through question. How did you fit into that culture with a very different DNA that you came with? Yeah, so I started in investment banking. It's funny you use the term bulge bracket because that's the way the big investment banks were referred to when I was applying for jobs in 1986. I ended up being having several job offers, much to pretty much everyone's surprise, because my background as a pre-med and so forth had nothing in common with investment banking, but I think people enjoyed my story. I was so naive that when I was interviewing, I would tell them, they'd say, well, why do you want to be an investment banker? I say, well, I don't want to be an investment banker, but I heard I can make a lot of money really quickly and I want to save a lot before I go to med school. So I think it was that honesty that was, um, I think people either felt sorry for me or thought I was kind of extremely bold. And, but that was it. And so I got a job at what was the best M&A department on Wall Street at the time, First Boston. That was the Bruce and Joe days.
Yeah.
And I look back at some of the folks who were in that department, they became leaders on Wall Street, and some of them are still around today. Like, for example, Ray McGuire is president of Lazard, and he was a third-year associate. Bio Ogunlesi, who was a young vice president back then, left First Boston after many years and created Global Infrastructure Partners, which was acquired by BlackRock, and now and Larry Fink, by the way, was at First Boston on the mortgage desk and left First Boston to create BlackRock. So those were some interesting days. Um, so I was actually a fish out of water in my investment banking days. The one place I think was the best cultural fit for me was a place called Hambrecht and Quist. It was acquired by Chase, and then Chase and JP Morgan merged. But that was a technology investment bank. I was working in um, Silicon Valley during the first internet bubble back from '98, and I stayed at the firm until uh, 2003. So when I went to Morgan Stanley, though, I joined after being CFO of Carver Bank, which was a small publicly traded bank. It was tiny, but it was the largest that had been founded in the late 1940s um, by people from the Harlem community at a time when Black people were not welcome at traditional banks. And so Carver Bank is still around today. It's still publicly traded. I joined as the heir apparent to the then CEO, became CFO, and then went to Morgan Stanley, initially be president of one of Morgan Stanley's bank subsidiaries to help grow that entity. Turns out my first day at Morgan Stanley was the first day Morgan Stanley became a bank holding company. And that was a period of turmoil that eventually landed me in a group, Global Sustainable Finance, where over time I became the head of that group responsible for all investments and loans in community development, which is essentially impact investing in the banking sector. That's the Community Reinvestment Act and something called the Public Welfare Investment Authority, which is a very powerful provision under the Bank Holding Company Act. Our group was extremely successful. People didn't understand what we were doing. Most people thought we were giving away Morgan Stanley's money, and they were shocked to hear that we actually were exceeding the return on equity targets that Morgan Stanley had for all his businesses. We exceeded it by a pretty strong measure. And that's because we were experts in what we then called lasagna finance, which was layers of capital that in opportunities structured to address all capital providers' risk appetite and return appetite. So what that means is we structured investments, including what everyone would call today blended finance, grants to government subsidy, tax credits, concessionary capital, and then market rate capital. And because we were expert at those very complex structures, we did two things. We made an extraordinary. We were extraordinarily profitable, I should say, and we were also extraordinary citizens, global citizens, because everything we did started with first of all, the Morgan Stanley Institution. So we wanted to make Morgan Stanley proud and burnish its image. But the community came first. So our goal was to be the absolute best community partners, make Morgan Stanley the great corporate citizen that it should be. and make a lot of money. Very fascinating story, Roy. I think this would need a full session, another podcast, to get into the various twists and turns in your career, all leading to where you are today. And I think the thought that really resonated with me is that when you invest for good, you still make money and meet the bank's hurdles for hurdle rates for return on capital and so on and so forth. But maybe, Christine, if I can turn to you, what really inspired you to transition into the impact investing ecosystem for yourself? And how has your journey shaped your current work at the Ford Foundation?
Yeah, well, like Roy, let me start by just thanking you and the AVPN team for the work you do and for creating a platform like this one to elevate these kinds of stories, because I think that's how we all learn and build community. And it's what makes this market really special. I'm constantly in awe of people kind of coming out of college these days who are incredibly focused and know exactly what they want to do. I was not that person. I grew up very kind of community service oriented, did a lot of volunteer work, went to a liberal arts college that was Jesuit, so had a lot of the social justice teachings as part of its curriculum. And the only thing I knew I wanted to do when I graduate was do some kind of volunteer work. I initially wanted to do the Peace Corps. That was a 2-year commitment, and my sister was getting married that summer, and they said I wouldn't be able to attend the wedding, so I dropped that, and I ended up doing a domestic volunteer program for my first year out of college, and I worked as a counselor in a drug treatment center in California. I think it remains the hardest job I've ever had. I don't think I was very good at it, but I spent the year trying to figure out what I'd do next, and a friend's parents said, had worked at Chase, said, I really think a good fundamental course and curriculum would be entering the global analyst training program. I think you can take that and do many, many things. And I thought that was really appealing. And so I started in banking, and I did that for several years and realized, I think through that experience, that I saw the important role finance plays in, broadly, I'd say, economic development. Not having a job, and my job was largely like supporting M&A transactions. So it didn't have the impact but I could see the power that capital had. And I was recognizing that. I also knew I wasn't getting passion out of my job. A lot of my peers were. And so that was also apparent to me. I I wanted, to maybe selfishly find a job that could combine the two. And my mentor at the bank said, "Well, I think business school would be a good platform. You can learn, develop a lot of skills that would be applicable in a very similar way that that initial training program provided." And so I went to business school, and my application very much read, if impact investing as a term had existed then, which it did not, it would have read that that's what I was looking to do. Um, I did a little consulting, and very opportunistically, as I often tell people when they ask how to get roles in this market, someone I was in business school with said, "There's this job at the Ford Foundation. You should really take a look at it. It seems like what you want to do." And kind of the rest is history. I've been at Ford over 20 years. It's crazy how long I've been working here, but it's been incredibly opportune, because when I started at Ford, they looked to me. They wanted someone who brought some of those finance skills to a role, and I looked to the Ford Foundation as this institution where I could just learn and absorb all of their work, which I came to with just not as much knowledge on how systems perpetuated a lot of the issue areas we're grappling to solve, and to start to test the application of investment capital as one tool to solve them. And I would just say my career at Ford has very, very nicely correlated with the impact investing market taking off, and Ford really doubling down on its own commitment to the space. So it's just a lot of opportunity intersecting with my own desires of what I wanted to do. And I feel really grateful for that.
Absolutely amazing, inspirational. I would say, hearing from both of you. I've also had a long, career and a long journey, and the twists and turns that we see along the way are all kind of leading to a good end, which we don't see when those twists and turns actually happened. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your background and journey. And maybe if I can pivot to a more strategic context, so to speak. And Roy, if I can for a moment get you to talk about the fact that Ford is committed over $1 billion in mission related investments. I think 1.3 odd $1 billion is the assets under management under the mission related investment piece. Could you give us an overview of the program in general, its vision, its structure, and how it fits into the Ford Foundation's broader mission? That would be really good for us to get a good context, strategic context of this.
I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to clarify mission-related investments. And two, Christine, get ready because I'm going to hand it off to you. And so let me first clarify. We have a $1 billion commitment from our endowment for mission-related investments. And the reason why I want to clarify mission-related investments is actually a technical term under our tax regime. The IRS in its guidelines uses that term to refer to endowment capital, which is under fiduciary obligations, and the freedom to invest endowment capital, which has fiduciary duties, in areas that are aligned with a foundation's mission. And the reason why that's important is because if there is a fiduciary duty regime that says that every investment has to chase the highest advertised return, then that means something like multifamily affordable rental housing, which is an absolute extraordinary risk-adjusted financial return opportunity. And frankly, the only area I believe where we can generate alpha. That may come into question if we're supposed to be chasing the absolute highest return regardless of risk. So that's an important distinction. The other $450 million in capital we have is program related investment capital. That is technically, that is not endowment capital, so it has no fiduciary obligations. Taken together, it's about 1.5 billion now. We just got approval to increase the size of our program related investment pool. Both are impact investing capital, and so MRIs, mission related investing, is a subset of impact investing. But impact investing, based on the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN, based on that definition, it is capital invested with the intention of generating double or triple bottom line returns and an actual return on that capital, or at least a return of capital. So impact investing exists along a spectrum, which is really important because a lot of people, there is a cognitive bias or cognitive dissonance, I should say, where people hear the term impact investing and they automatically think concessionary.
Yeah.
And that is, that's inaccurate. Impact investing can be concessionary, but it doesn't have to be concessionary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine. The reason why is because Christine is I'll describe it as the brains behind Darren Walker's influence brawn. And what I mean by that is Darren is the person who asked the question that Clara Miller had asked before him at FB Heron: what about the other 95%? And that relates to the fact that foundations are seen in many instances as private investment clubs that give away money as a hobby. The joke is about the lung cancer prevention foundation that made a killing in tobacco stocks. And that is just the idea that theoretically a foundation's endowment can make investments in an area that supports the very types of issues that the charitable element I'm trying to address. So, for example, the easy example, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's Johnson and Johnson, right? So it's health, physical, mental. Well, if you think about social media, and if you're an investor in a social media company, social media has been proven to create um, severe mental health issues, which generate extraordinary costs to our mental health system and society. So that's an example of how you can be a charitable foundation. You might focus on eliminating healthcare issues, but you're investing in entities that create healthcare problems. So Christine basically masterminded the work to help Darren convince the Ford Foundation Board of Trustees to take that gigantic leap of faith and allocate $1 billion of an endowment to impact investing or mission-related investing. And with that, Christine, I hope I've given you enough time to gather your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to talk about this, we have to go back about 10 years. And as Roy said, our president at the time, Darren Walker, was early in his tenure, and he had shared that he wanted the Ford Foundation to focus on the very large, ambitious goal of reducing inequality. And to do that, we had to be really intentional and thoughtful about using all the assets we had. And he named up front that he felt like our endowment was one of our biggest assets, if it is our biggest asset. And we were not at that time using it to advance our mission through the investments we were making directly. And these big ideas, they take incredible leadership. And it's hard taking decades long institutions who've been operating in a certain way and to change them. These are big ships to turn. And so I can't emphasize enough what that kind of courageous leadership means. And Karen really emboldened that for Ford. And he got us all focused on this big idea. And we worked with our board over a 15-month period to educate them, talk about what we meant when we were talking about impact investing and the role it could play in advancing Ford's mission, talking about what we felt the financial return opportunities could be, the impact of opportunities could be. And I share that it took 15 months because it wasn't an easy task, right? To convince a bunch of people to change the way an endowment is functioning. And it was a big bet. It was the largest commitment at its time from a private foundation for a mission-related investment strategy. We're happy to say that the California Endowment has now surpassed us with its $3 or $4 billion dedicated to this work. And we hope many more will do so. So that starts with the vision, the why. From a structure perspective, we set up this mission investments portfolio as we run it as an independent endowment, right? It's part of the main endowment, but it has its own strategy. And we focus that strategy on some thematic areas where we really felt there were large social issues that we could address responsibly and profitably through investments. Our focus is largely in private markets, not exclusively, but predominantly. And that was strategically because we felt that that was where we could be really intentional about the impact we wanted to achieve. And from a structure perspective, our portfolio is governed by an investment committee of our board who has approval authority over the investments we make. And that ensures both that, we continue to perform from a financial and impact return perspective sustainably over time. And we're a little over 9 years in. We've committed about, I think, 60% of that $1 billion And we've been incredibly pleased with the results, although constantly caveat all of our performance as quite early. Um, but so far, so good.
That's fascinating. And I completely kind of agree with the point that we all have to be sustainable. And having a double bottom line is absolutely critical, but financial returns are equally critical for us to be really sustainable. And I presume your portfolio has delivered market returns for this quantum of investment, which, although it's called impact investment, is in line with market returns, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think we would caveat it, as a risk adjusted return based on the asset classes we're investing in. As Roy shared, this isn't about maximizing returns. We could invest in real estate and seek other opportunities, but to really deliver on an impact and financial return, we've identified, bespoke strategies where we really feel like we can do both really well.
Well, I guess since we are based in the global south, I guess one of the big issues in the global south, of course, is the fact that there's a large funding gap for us to meet our sustainable development goals. Um, is the Ford Foundation, and I know you've been investing in the global south. Um, any thoughts around how you have looked at this issue and tried to solve it? Although I do believe that a large portion of your investments are US centric, but I know you are also focused on the global south. So some thoughts around how you're tackling this issue would be great for our audience as well.
That's why Rory and I do the podcast together. We can um, So, yes, we've actually been, in our early days, as Roy shared, we have this more catalytic program related investment portfolio. And in the early days of our program related investment fund, which started in the late 60s, one of the themes that we were early in on was microfinance. And that was a portfolio that was built in the global south. And we learned an incredible amount from that strategy. And it was through that learning, through that experience, as that particular sector evolved and matured, that it became one of our core themes for the endowment from a financial inclusion perspective, where we really looked now in an era decades later where technology was playing an incredibly different role in scaling, reducing cost as a strategy where we could reach more responsibly and achieve profitability through the strategy. So we leaned in on that. That's one of our core themes um, outside of the United States, out of the endowment. And we continue to use our program related investment to play a role in catalyzing whatever those next sectors could be and could evolve to be. And that can be both from a thematic approach, from what are the next strategies that could advance or help reduce inequality. It could also be what are the next places or geographies or communities where we can use this type of capital to help contribute it to solving some big social issues. So we lean on both. And you're right. More of our capital right now is in the US market, but I would say it's a big area for the team to be leaning in certain areas where we have regional offices and people on the ground to help build out both the impact investing infrastructure, supporting groups like AVPN as an example, to both educate investors as well as develop the ecosystem where capital can just flow in a more efficient way and effectively to the communities we care about. Um, so I'll stop there and pass it to Roy.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. So I will add to that a couple other reasons why our capital flows to the global south with our endowment funds has not kind of, flooded the gates, if you will. First of all, um, you have two-thirds of our senior investing staff on this podcast. We are responsible for covering um, uh, the a broad swath: the U.S., South America, Africa, India, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, China, um, and I'm sure I'm leaving something out. I can't remember. I may have said Africa. So that's a limiter. Number one. Number two, a part of our work is not just around. We have an unusual um, mandate, or I should say, challenge we've taken on, and that is we try to be problem solvers, not just investors. And what that means is we spend a lot of time, panels, speeches, writing, talking about the ways that the capital markets can be enhanced. When it comes to the global South, that includes what I'll call a cavernous gap between perceived risk and actual risk, and that creates a bit of dysfunction in the way capital flows. Let me use Africa as an example because I was just in Johannesburg last week at the uh, Qatar Africa Business Forum, where we were discussing, what's happening with impact investing on the continent. So let me give you an example in a fixed income context. Um, Specifically infrastructure, because infrastructure is making a lot of headlines these days, and it's a pretty broad swath. African infrastructure projects default at a rate of 5.5%. That is lower than Latin America at 12.9%, Asia at 8.8%, and Eastern Europe at 8.6%. And this is all based on data from S&P, Brookings, some others. It's not so. African borrowers, however, pay a 9.8% cost of capital compared with 5.3% to 6.8% for the same peers I just mentioned, with comparable risk profiles on paper. That gap costs African borrowers about $75 billion annually. So that is a systematic mispricing that is driven by media narratives that slow flows of capital and actually can chase investors away. So one of the things we do is we try to work to understand how do we solve some of the issues that could open the floodgates, because that helps everyone. It helps capital come in, it helps development, and it helps exits. So so we can create our own value through narrative change. So that's something that we've been working on, and it takes time.
Yeah, building the narrative is obviously very critical. And the example you gave in Africa, very pertinent. I think perceptions do kind of lead to mispricing. And I think this is an important juncture where I could possibly ask about the concept of patient and catalytic capital. Um, so I guess one of the things that we always talk about in Asia, where many of us are familiar with the ecosystem here, is that there is no lack of capital, but there's probably a lack of bankable deals. And the bankability of a deal, of course, when we talk about the financial institutions and the banks, they obviously want to see a robust, cash flow profile. They want to see a technology which is well kind of demonstrated in performance and so on and so forth. So while we look to build a narrative around some of the mispricing issues, do you believe catalytic capital can equally play a very important role in building the ecosystem? And is that something that resonates with Ford? And I'm sure it does. And how do you kind of allocate that catalytic capital to get projects to be more bankable? Because you do have different pools of capital in your armory, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll kick off with that. The first big picture acknowledgement we have to make is that philanthropy cannot solve all the world's problems. We are tiny compared to other sources of capital. We operate in the human interest, etc. There are roles for everyone. Everyone can play. And that's one of the beauties of what we call lasagna finance or blended finance. And that is, it is ultimately, if you believe in the, I don't know, 500-year-old concept of the role of government, it's ultimately the role of government to enhance the quality of life of its citizens. And so that's where the buck stops. And so one of the things that's been great about the US is an extraordinary venture capitalist. Just we are outstanding. Our capitalist system is just phenomenal, huge. It can be improved, but we as a government, we understand that by enriching our private sector, we enrich society. Now, I won't get into the cavernous gaps because of income and wealth at this moment. You may have another question on that, but number one, I mean, what do you say about a government that created the internet and the trillions in value that has stemmed from that globally? The wealth. I was at a meeting somewhere recently where I learned that, and I don't know if this is true, but I heard that 50% of NVIDIA's employees, I think they have 36,000 employees. So that means 18,000 have wealth of 25 million or more. It's government. That's all stemming ultimately from government investment, and the list of air sectors that the government in the U.S. created is, I mean, fills volumes. That's number one. So the government taking the lead is the number one cause of social wealth and prosperity. That's what Adam Smith said in his two books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. And that's what the U.S. has done. So that's now the beauty of blended finance is every deal that has a non-zero chance of being bankable can be bankable. And that's because the level of subsidy and risk in protection and credit enhancement can all be in design. And that's where we specialize. That doesn't mean we provide all the capital. So we may see instances where we may come in the third tranche and we need the first and second tranche of loss protection. If we can't get that, the deal doesn't get done. But that's the big opportunity. And the Why Nations Fail is a book by Nobel Prize winning economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. It lays out the blueprint for prosperous society. That's inclusion and that's the appropriate role of government, just as Adam Smith said. So Adam Smith laid it all out. We've misinterpreted the Adam Smith model of a healthy economic system in capitalism because instead of reading all the works, we've read excerpts, and those experts had been they've abridged and censored much of the contents that speaks to the role that government can have to propel society towards prosperity.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And the way you've covered theory with practice is incredibly refreshing, Roy. But maybe if I can get the discussion, and I'm conscious of time, but this is so interesting. But if I can get the discussion a little more grounded, how does Ford actually measure success, and how do you measure the success of your investment thesis, both from a financial return and from an impact return point of view? What does success mean for you and mean for Ford Foundation?
We use very simple metrics. The financial return hurdle for us is our spend rate plus inflation. In the U.S., charitable foundations um, um, have a legally mandated spend rate. It's 5%. We spend more than that. We spend roughly 5.8%. And for a perpetual foundation, if you want to maintain your purchasing power, then you add on top of that inflation. So let's just call it rough numbers, 9%. That is our financial hurdle. And if we achieve that, then we are contributing to the viability of our perpetual foundation mandate. That's number one. and we far exceeded that. And number two, we have a set of impact investing themes that are essentially problems that we believe we can address and or solve or work towards a solution and generate financial returns that fit our hurdle rate. So for multifamily affordable rental housing, the problem is a severe shortage of affordable housing supply in the US. Our single metric is how many units preserved or developed by our investments, period. So you can have 1,000 metrics for everything. There are those who fall into the analysis paralysis trap, and you spend so much time coming up with your metrics that you never put any capital to work. We go the opposite way. We have a bias for action, and we learn as we go, share as we learn, and if we make mistakes, we figure out why we made them. Were they um, errors of omission or commission? And we fix and we keep it moving.
Right. So, would it be right to say that for each of your themes of investments, you have a very simple matrix that you kind of implement? And maybe a follow through question here, because impact measurement and management is, of course, a very intrinsic part of impact investing. Um, and so, where does one draw the line between not getting caught up in, too much analysis and also not having just one parameter, because that may seem a little too simplified to the average person trying to understand impact investing? Any thoughts around that?
Well, and Christine, I'll jump in again. Let me just say that I've had the great fortune of going to extremely prestigious educational institutions. I've worked in some of the top financial institutions in the world. I've been taught by Nobel Prize winning economists. And for sure, I've read tens of thousands of pages, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. And at a certain point, and everyone reaches this point at different times in their life, but things crystallize. And one of the things that's crystallized to me is sometimes a simple solution is the best solution. And in order to do that, you have to trust your judgment. And so we can't decide for others how many metrics to choose. We have decided that our single metric, that doesn't mean we don't look at other things, but we have decided that for our board of trustees to demonstrate that we are doing the job we are supposed to be doing, we don't need a lot of metrics. And that takes confidence and judgment and judgment based on experience, exposure, et cetera. So Christine, anything to add?
Yeah, I would probably just say inherent in Roy's response is that we're looking for incredibly values aligned partners who want to learn. And I think we're at an incredibly interesting time in the market where technology is going to help us do this work even better and more robustly. And that learning curve will continue to go up. Um, so, our partners are often incredible leaders in practices of impact measurement and management. It's why we value them as partners, because while they may be reporting back to us on many metrics, because they're trying to see links between health and housing and workforce opportunity and education, et cetera. And we want to learn alongside them, but we also don't want to burden the market with 100 metrics that none of us really can make sense of at a point in time. So I think we have a learning philosophy, a simplistic approach right now, given the depth of information we have and have experienced and learned over the decades in the sectors we're investing in. And so that helps ground us kind of with the approach we've taken.
No, perfect. I think that sums it up really well. I'm conscious of time and, conscious of your time. We've covered a lot so far. I think, we can go on because just listening to your stories is so fascinating. But maybe in conclusion, if I can ask both Roy and you, Christine, to share what advice would you give to impact investors that are looking to invest in emerging markets? Many of our listeners are investors, GPs, LPs that operate in emerging markets in the global south. From your vantage point and the years of experience that you've had, what advice would you give them as they look at emerging markets from an impact perspective?
Don't fall into analysis paralysis. You can study this for so long. Our philosophy has been to kind of take the approach of taking action. I think that's how you learn. So I'd encourage everyone fundamentally appreciate the risk and return and impact objectives you have, and then start. It's the beautiful part of this market is it's one that leans much more towards cooperation than competition. People love to share their experiences, what they're learning, lean into that. And there's really not a need initially to recreate the wheel. And at the same time, we should all just be, open to as much innovation as we can to solving some of these big problems. And there's incredible cross learning, right? Like the US markets can learn from countries within the African market, vice versa. It's there's a lot going on with different experiences. And so anyway, I would just say get going as my one contribution here.
To find trusted local partners across sectors, public sector, private sector, philanthropic, NGO. That's all I have to add.
I think that's very opportune because that's exactly what a platform like ABPN seeks to do, is to bring in different voices and to bring in local operating partners from the entire ecosystem. So partnerships between unlikely partners can be formed. Christine and Roy, thank you so much. It's been an hour of very interesting conversation from my perspective personally, and I speak behalf of my colleagues as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. Your commitment to building the impact ecosystem is absolutely amazing, and we look forward to more engagement in the months to come.